Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari has presented a record budget of 20.51 trillion naira, about $47.4 billion for 2023. Spending is up 18.4% for this year. But with inflation currently running at over 20% and forecast at 17.16% for next year in the budget, there is unlikely to be much, if any, change in real terms. The president said Nigeria's economy is projected to grow 3.7% in 2023, up marginally from the 3.55% rate expected this year. The budget deficit is projected to be 10.78 trillion naira. Oil revenue is projected at 1.92 trillion naira, with 1.69 million barrels of crude oil expected to be produced per day. The presidency also pegged the benchmark at $70 per barrel, while the exchange rate was put at 435.57 naira to the dollar. With Nigeria's economy flagging its vital oil production at an all-time low and insecurity remaining a major problem, the next president faces a host of urgent issues. Is this budget one that will address some of those before the new president comes in? Joining the conversation is Wale Ajayi. He's partner and head tax, regulatory and people services, KPMG, Nigeria. Wale, it's good to have you back. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge again.
Good morning. I'm happy to be back.
So let's start with what President Buhari himself inherited in terms of the budgets. And he inherited a budget size of about 4.5 trillion naira in 2015. But in closing his tenure, he's closing it with a 20.51 trillion naira budget. What's your overall assessment of his performance when it comes to allocation and even implementation of budgets across all sectors of the economy during his time?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think the problem we've had in Nigeria is so much of non-performance. When you look at the revenue that we've set for ourselves, there's never been a year we've been able to meet that revenue target. And I don't expect that this year will be different. You look at last year, we're probably doing close to about 63% of revenue. And the major source of revenue for Nigeria has been oil. And oil revenue has been hit, by lack of output. Even though the price of crude is pretty very high in the market now, we are barely producing less than 1 million barrels of crude. And, it's surprising that Nigeria is a country that used to exceed its OPEC quota. We used to close to about 2 million barrels of crude. Now we're barely doing 1 million. And that has really been the biggest challenge that we face. So, yes, we can have a budget, that is going to, deliver about 11 trillion that is estimated in terms of revenue. But if you also look at the size of the deficit, which is growing, the deficit in the budget now is about 10 trillion, which is about, more than 3% of the threshold that is set in the fiscal responsibility bill. Of course, somebody might say that we've already adjusted that threshold. It can be as high as what we want it to be, as long as the existence of Nigeria is not threatened. So, at the end of the day, the problem we've had in Nigeria has been that of revenue challenge. And if we can't deal with that problem, then this budget will go the same way that other budgets have done. Performance.
So it's a good thing you mentioned the deficit, because that's where I'm headed next. As you said, 10.78 trillion naira. And the president has said that Nigeria would fund this deficit by borrowing, selling national assets, and with project-specific loans. Now, we know the issue around selling national assets has always been one that's been quite contentious. And even with this administration, it's come up, but then it has died down again. Are those really good plans, really good ways to actually deal with Nigeria's budget deficit issue, which is a recurring issue? It's not necessarily a Buhari administration issue, but it is a recurring issue.
I think the point I would make is that the issue in Nigeria is not so much as the deficit or the fact that we're borrowing, to finance the budget. I think the issue is what do we do with the money we borrow. Now, if you look at the 2023 budget and spend the trend in all the budget that we've seen, we're spending close to about 6.3 trillion, on debt service. We're going to spend about 5 trillion, on personnel costs. So in total, you're spending about 11 trillion, which is the same amount of revenue that you expect to generate. So we're not spending our revenue on capital expenditure, on capital goods that will actually generate income for Nigeria. And so that's been the problem in Nigeria. Yes, we can borrow. We have so many assets that are lying fallow. That we can actually, look at and sell. We can also sell down some of the investment that Nigeria has maybe in the games so that we can actually reduce, the debt stock. Well, when you speak to analysts and investors, they will tell you that the problem we have in Nigeria is not so much as debt. And I agree with that, because when you look at the level of debt in Nigeria today is about 3 trillion, right, which is less than 30%. It's currently about 20% of our GDP. So we still have scope to borrow. But at the end of the day, the question is, what do we borrow to finance? That is the problem that we need to deal with.
Okay, so all these issues tie into the other, because as we move from the deficit issue, it also means we have to talk about debt servicing. That's one of the reasons we're having a deficit, because we have debts that we need to service. And just a few short months ago, it was revealed that Nigeria's debt servicing costs actually overtook the country's revenue. But there's also a contentious part of this, and that's the Minister of Finance, Budget and Planning, Zainab Ahmed, who has consistently said that Nigeria doesn't have a debt problem, but the country has a revenue one. And the Debt Management Office also says Nigeria's debt to GDP ratio is 23%, which is still within the country's self-imposed limit of 40%. So when you look at this budget, the largest ever in the history of the country, does it look like a budget that is looking to solve Nigeria's revenue problem, or even beginning the process of solving Nigeria's revenue problem?
No, it doesn't. I mean, there's so many things that we can do. I mean, I agree with the assessment by the Honorable Minister and by the Budget Office that we don't have that problem. But what we have is a revenue challenge problem. We need to grow our revenue. Our revenue currently contributes about 20% of the revenue. I mean, like I've said in my opening, right? If we're supposed to be producing close to about 1.8 million barrels of oil by OPEC quota, and we're doing less than 1 million, then where's the money going to come from? We have to borrow to be able to finance the budget. So I think the problem I see is, how do we plug some of the revenue leakage that we have in Nigeria? We're spending close to about 6 trillion on subsidy. It's not sustainable. It is high time we got rid of subsidy. But of course, the question is, does the government has the willpower, to do that? We also need to look at some of the incentives that we've given, and ask ourselves, are they being effective? Are they delivering the purpose for which they are meant to achieve? Look at the government-owned enterprises. How efficient are they? Are they even remitting the surplus fund they're meant to be remitting? So there's so many other things we can do. And of course, there's also the issue of revenue tax itself, the tax administration framework. How do we make it more efficient? Right? So I agree with the assessment that it's not a debt issue that we have in Nigeria, but a revenue problem. And so the question we'll be asking ourselves is, how do we grow our revenue, to be able to reduce our borrowing? If we don't have revenue, unfortunately, we don't have any other choice but to borrow. But unfortunately, we're not spending the borrowed money, on things that will on capital goods. So that's the challenge we have.
So it feels like you're just a little bit ahead of me, because we're going now further into this revenue conversation, Wale. The oil price benchmark was pegged at $70 per barrel, with a daily oil production estimate of 1.69 million barrels. Yet Nigeria has slipped to about 900,000 barrels per day, and we were recently overtaken by Angola as the continent's largest crude oil producer. So many are asking, is this even a realistic projection? At this amount, how much is Nigeria expected to even make from oil in this budget? And let's not also forget, we've seen oil prices hit highs that the market hasn't seen in years, but the country was unable to take advantage of that. Is $70 a barrel a safe place in this budget, or a safe price benchmark in this budget?
The issue is not with the benchmark price. $70 is very low. If you look at the current market price now, it's about in the range of $92, $93 per barrel. So that's not the issue that we have. The issue we have in Nigeria is output. How do we grow our output? But because we've not made investment in the oil industry for a very long time, and of course the issue of oil theft, and of course vandalism, that has reduced significantly the amount of barrel we can produce. Until we deal with the issue of oil theft, right, then we can't get anywhere. Oil theft, as far as I'm concerned, has become an organized crime. Do we even know where the oil goes? Who is buying? Who are the people that are buying our oil? Right? Can we trace the oil? That's the problem. If we can't deal with that, then there is really nothing we can do. But of course, the government is aware of that. And if you look at what happened last year. Last year, revenue was projected of $2 per barrel. In the middle of the year, we increased that to $70. So the problem is not the price, but the output. Can we grow the output? So when you look at the output of $1,090,000, that is totally unrealistic. Looking at where we are today, until we deal with the issue of oil theft, then I'm afraid we cannot get anywhere with revenue from crude oil sale.
And so the issue or the conversation around the crude oil benchmark or even the revenue conversation then again naturally goes into this conversation about subsidy. You mentioned 6 trillion, and we know that that's what many of Nigeria's partners are saying we might eventually spend in the coming 2023. But in President Muhammadu Buhari's budget that he presented, he allocated 3.6 trillion to fund fuel subsidy for the first half. So if we add that together, let's just do a natural equation here. That takes you to about that takes you to 7.2 trillion possible for the entire year of 2023, and that is already more than 1/4 of this 20.51 trillion naira budget. And it could also increase depending on a number of factors. What do you make of this? The fact that Nigeria is likely to spend over 7 trillion naira on subsidy next year.
But when you look at what the president said, I mean, it's based on the assumption that subsidy is going to end in mid-2023, all right? And if subsidy ends in 2023, then they're budgeting that will probably cost us about 3.64 trillion naira. But the problem is, will it end? Do we have the willpower to deal with the issue of subsidy? By the time we get to mid-year, I mean, the president would have left. We're going to have a new government. The new government is going to start, its administration, on the back note. All right, so those are the issues. I don't think we have the willpower. Hopefully, that local refinery will come on stream. Right, even then, we still have to remove subsidy because what will happen is that the price of crude will still be high. Right, at least it makes sense for us to subsidize production rather than consumption. So, as far as I'm concerned, right, it's the issue is do we have the willpower. I'm happy that the state governors have realized that the issue of subsidy is not sustainable. I mean, in the past, when government says we need to reduce subsidy, eliminate subsidy, they've always been the supporters of subsidy. But when you find yourself in a situation where we're spending 65% of our crude oil revenue on subsidy alone, since December last year, which was the last time NNPC was able to remit to the Federation Allocation Account Committee, right? We've not been able to remit anything, right? Because there's just no revenue to remit. And all the governors, all the state governors are now crying. So, with respect to subsidy, the big question is, do we have the willpower to do what is inevitable? Because as far as I'm concerned, it is inevitable. We need to get rid of subsidy and focus on subsidized production rather than consumption.
And when you add subsidy to this equation, it just tells you how much loss Nigeria is running at. So total collectible revenue is estimated to be about 16.87 trillion from the 20.51 trillion in the 2023 budget. And unfortunately, there are a number of things that seem to be becoming recurrent and repeat things with Nigeria's budget. And this issue of running at a loss is also one. But the president did say something about taxes. He said to support the realization of fiscal projection, current tax and fiscal laws and regulation are being reviewed to produce a draft finance bill of 2022. So we know that we had one that was recently reviewed and amended, I think it was 2019 or 2020 as it was. But now when it comes to this one, yes, 2021, there's going to be a new one. There's going to possibly be more taxes on people that many people say are even being overtaxed as it is. What do you make of that when you look at the numbers and all of this? Estimated revenue at 16.87 trillion only, some subsidy that's going to go to about 7.2 trillion in a 20.51 trillion, debt servicing, all of that. What do you make of the tax aspect of this?
I think there's no doubt in my mind and in everybody's mind that the only source of revenue now has to be tax revenue, right? And tax revenue is very predictable. I mean, you can actually know how much you're going to collect from tax. And when you look at the performance of the Federal Land Revenue Service, I mean, on PET and company income tax, they're doing close to 100% of the targets, right? The ground custom, okay, so, I mean, maybe about 50% of the target. So tax is what's going to come to the rescue. So what I expect the government will focus on, I mean, using the Finance Act. The Finance Act, it just gives you the platform to be able to ensure that tax laws reflect current realities and that we can get rid of any archaic law. And if there is one thing that this present government has done, is that they've been very consistent since we had a very Finance Act in 2019. And I expect to have that continuing in 2022 to support the financing of the budget for 2023. Now, I think the focus has to be on maybe pro-head taxes, right? Like we have with carbon, with the one on sugar, the excess duties on sugar. So government has to look at that. I don't think VAT is the way to go. They shouldn't increase the rate of VAT because people can look at the rate of VAT and think Nigeria has the lowest VAT in West Africa, but that is not correct. We also need to look at the total deductions that we make. Nigeria, we don't need to deduct as much as they do in other countries. So the government has to focus on taxes that will promote health or reduce expenditure on health expenditure. And then we also need to look at the incentives that we need. So anytime we grant incentives in Nigeria, do we actually sit down to evaluate what the impact of that incentive is? In 2020, the government promised that every time they come up with a budget and there's an incentive, there will always be a tax expenditure statement that shows the cost of the incentive. If you follow what happened in the UK, for example, recently, right, when the first government decided to cut, the base rate, the top rate of 5p, for people that earn about £150,000, there was no outcry because there was no expenditure statement, which is very abnormal. So we also need to do the same. We need to be able to have an expenditure statement that shows how much is going to cost us so that we can then determine whether it makes sense or not to do those incentives. We need to look at our pioneer stakeholders and ask ourselves, right? Are we giving setups that will be beneficial to the economy? So those are things that we need to do because obviously we need to talk that. But I think at the end of the day also that we need to find the way to bring as many people to the tax time. We need to make the tax authorities more efficient. We need to be able to deploy technology. We thank God that, from what we're saying, that FRS has deployed technology. The various tax authorities are also deploying technology. But can it be more effective, right? The way they deploy the technology. So we need to do that, and we also need to get rid of multiple taxes. That has actually affected the economic development of Nigeria. But of course, I can understand where the state governments are coming from because the only source of revenue, which is food on, has reduced drastically. So everybody is focusing on that. But that's not the way to do. We need to release money to the private sector to grow the economy. So, I agree with what government wants to do with taxes, but let's be more efficient, let's be more proactive, and let's be more responsive, to ensure that the private sector continues to grow and deliver the goods.
So there's an estimated GDP growth rate for Nigeria, a projection that is of 3.75%. And this also tallies with an exchange rate of about 435.57 naira. That's to the dollar, even though at the parallel markets, it's running anywhere around 730 or 700 naira. When you look at all of that, and then you also add the fact that we have a very fast growing population, this budget is one that many want to see put Nigeria in line for growth, in line for productivity, and for the economy to move forward. But we've come out of 2 recessions under the tenure of President Muhammadu Buhari, but he's also faced COVID. And right now we're currently facing the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Do you think that this is a budget that is on the way to putting us in the right direction?
Well, I wish I could say yes, but the simple answer is probably no. There are some good sides to the budget, but at the end of the day, it still has to do with revenue. How do we grow our revenue? How do we grow our expenditure? How do we reduce our expenditure? As long as we don't have the means to be able to reduce our expenditure, then that's a problem. If you're spending your money, you had money on salary, right? We need to reorganize the civil service. We need to further the size of government. The size of governance in Nigeria is so expensive. We need to deal with that. But we know what to do. But the problem has always been the willpower to be able to do that. So when you look at the exchange rate that you quoted at 435, and then you go to the black market at 700, nobody's going to be able to access that 435. We have scarcity of foreign exchange in Nigeria because we're not just selling enough crude in Nigeria. So all these things are interrelated. If you don't deal with the issue of oil theft, then we can't have the revenue that we need to be able to grow the revenue, to grow the economy. And so for me, when you look at it from revenue perspective, so maybe from the tax side, you probably do well, but from the non-oil side is where we have a problem. And that is where we need to ask ourselves, how do we deal with the problem in that sector? And you've spoken about the exchange rate. Like I've said, even the GDP growth of all, that they've said they're going to grow at, close to about 4.75% or thereabout. I don't think it's realistic. I mean, I know we did about 3.5 or thereabouts at the second quarter. People always wonder, where is that growth coming from? Despite the fact that we don't have infrastructure, in Nigeria. But I think it's going to be a tough sell, right? We might do very well with respect to non-oil revenue, but oil revenue will be fall short. But we need to find a way to control the cost of governance in Nigeria, for us to be able to have a meaningful and active body.
Okay. So, Wale, before I let you go, when you look at this budget and the fact that the new president will be voted for in February, but finally sworn in May of 2023, this budget has a good 5 or 6 months before a new administration comes in. What would you say are the top 3 economic issues that Nigeria's president will need to deal with, looking at this budget and the reality of Nigeria heading into the elections?
I think the very first thing that any new government needs to do, if they have the willpower, we need to get to where we want to do, is to remove subsidy. We need to eliminate subsidy. I know it's going to be a tough sell, but it has to be a gradual process. We need to look at where it has been done before and take lessons from that. Can it be done? Yes, it can be done. But we need to deal with the issue of subsidy. That's one, the top issue. The second issue we need to deal with is to reduce the size of governance in Nigeria. We cannot afford to be spending the entire revenue we generate in Nigeria on debt and personnel costs. That has to go down. Personnel costs has to go down. Government-owned enterprises have to be efficient. Where we have all government assets all over the whole place, look at Lagos State here. I mean, if you look at Lagos, for example, you have to look at the Federal Secretariat, and there's so many other any other assets like that are lying fallow, right? We need to find a way to dispose of them and sell them. So we need to reduce the size of government. And of course, the third thing that the government needs to do is to be able to enhance the tax administration framework in Nigeria, especially when it comes to incentives. How do we make our incentives more effective? How do we determine that every time that we grant incentives to government, to investors, we're able to determine what is the impact on the economy. Those are 3 top things that I believe the government will have to do. Eliminate subsidy, reduce the size of governance, and of course, enhance the tax administration framework.
All right, Wale Ajayi, thank you so much for joining me. There is still more on this. It is a budget proposal that is now before the National Assembly. There'll be deliberations and conversations, possibly some slashing, some plus or minus. So what it finally will be is something we'll be talking to you about in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, Wale.